Why not go through the A to Z of these commonly used training terms so that people who might feel overwhelmed or too embarrassed to ask or just don't have the time to go look all of these up can get a very high-level overview of what all of them mean. Hello friends, welcome back to the channel. If you are new here, my name is Sarah and I make videos about health and fitness and all of those things endurance sports. So if you're the type of person that looks at your workday as recovery between workouts, you're my kind of person. You should hit any or all of those buttons down below. I appreciate you. Thanks for coming. But today's video, I want to do something that I hope will be very helpful for a lot of you folks out there, whether you are brand new or very experienced to endurance sport and training. And this idea actually came up when I was in a forum the other day, and there was a gentleman who had asked about acronyms and training terms and wondered if there was a resource out there that defined all of those different acronyms or fancy scientific terms used when it comes to discussing cycling or running or triathlon, because it can be very overwhelming. Whether you're in forums or you're reading an article or research paper, you can really drown in all of the alphabet soup and word salad out there. And it's not intentional to be exclusionary. These are just the terms being used and people get comfortable with them and they shorthand them with acronyms, and it can be very overwhelming for people who are getting into understanding the training science. And while you can find these terms defined by doing a simple Google search, or sometimes you'll find a resource that defines a few related terms, I realized that there really wasn't a one-stop shop type of resource that says, yeah, here's the A to Z of the commonly used terms out there, and this is what they all mean from a very high-level standpoint. And I remember that several years ago, I had started a document for myself defining these terms because of the lack of such a resource. And I shared it with this gentleman, and I thought, well, why not make this into a video? Why not go through the A to Z of these commonly used training terms so that people who might feel overwhelmed or too embarrassed to ask or just don't have the time to go look all of these up can get a very high-level overview of what all of them mean. And if they want to dive deeper into one of these terms, they can go ahead and do that, at their discretion and at their convenience. So what I want to do is go through this list that I've created, A to Z, and I will give you a very high-level definition. For me to go deep into the science for each of these terms, let's face it, none of us have the time for that. My content is long enough as it is. Now, some of these terms are things that you are probably already familiar with, whether you've seen it in your own research or in your own training. Some of these might be things that are brand new to you, and some of these that I will describe will be concepts that you're familiar with and just didn't know that there was an acronym or a training term surrounding that general concept. So hopefully there's value in this for everybody, and you'll learn something and you'll know whether or not you want to kind of continue to research some of these concepts. So starting at the top with letter A, we have AC, which is anaerobic capacity. You will see this very commonly in workout nomenclature, in the ride instructions or in-ride instructions on your screen, increasing anaerobic capacity, things to that effect. And what this is referring to is your power execution at an anaerobic rate. So speaking specifically to power, we're looking at increasing our anaerobic capacity, right? How much power we can execute at that very high level of execution where you're no longer using oxygen as a primary source of fuel. And it's usually described in percentage of FTP, but you could certainly talk about your anaerobic capacity in watts or in watts per kilogram, but usually percentage of FTP is what you will see out there in terms of your anaerobic capacity. Next on the list, we have AEPF, which is average effective pedal force. And this describes the amount of force on average that you are executing on the pedals around the entire 360-degree circle. Now, this isn't anything that's particularly important for you to know in a vacuum, but sometimes you'll be reading some articles or research that talk about how that relates to force in the legs and muscular engagement. So you may see that thrown about, but what that's really measuring is how much circumferential force you're putting on the pedal stroke. And this is usually going to be about half of the peak power on the downstroke. Because we're so downstroke dominant, it just tends to correlate with about half of that number. But if you've ever used a power meter with pedal dynamics like a Garmin or Power Tap or an Axioma, you'll usually see those kind of graphs or charts of your pedal stroke, and you'll see that, well, you don't put an even amount of power around the full 360 degrees. So it's really trying to average that out over the 360 degrees. Next up, we have AP. That means average power. Average power is the arithmetic mean of your power. So it's not like normalized power, which I'll talk about here shortly. It's literally just taking all of your power values, adding them up, and then giving you the arithmetic average. Next up, we have ATL, acute training load. Now, I'm going to link a video down below and at the end screen here. It's called Fitness Explained. I would recommend, if you want to understand things like ATL, CTL, TSB, TSS, I'll go through each of these at a high level in this video. But these are ones that are not ultra scientific, that are important to understand if you want to track your training over the course of a season or a course of a year, using things like Training Peaks, Strava, Today's Plan. Understanding where these terms come from can be really helpful. And instead of repeating that all here, I'm going to reference you to that video down below. It is a longer video, but it is a very good primer to understand how these programs work and how these different metrics work. But the high level overview is ATL is acute training load. It's a representation of the amount of load on average, usually for the last 7 days. So it gives you an appraisal of fatigue, how much load has been baked into the system with some recency. Next up, we have AWC, and this is anaerobic work capacity. This is different than anaerobic capacity because it's not measured in watts. It's actually measured in kilojoules. And what this is measuring is what you have in the fuel tank. So we always talk about in the vernacular as burning matches. Well, we're just kind of guessing how many matches you have to burn. Well, believe it or not, there's actually a measurement for this. How many kilojoules you have in the system that you can kind of draw from to burn those matches. And you exhaust those kilojoules that you have in the system by either higher execution of power or longer execution of power. You only have so much in that tank. So you can train to add more to that tank, but this is an actual measurement of what's in that tank of reserve. You'll also see this referred to as watt prime. I'll talk about that as I go through the alphabet, but anaerobic work capacity is what you have in the tank to work above your VO2 max. So this is anaerobic. There's another term I will talk about here shortly that's slightly different, but remember that anaerobic work capacity is the amount of kilojoules you have available to use anaerobically or above your VO2 max. Next up, we have capital C, that is typically used to delineate calories. Capital C calories, which is usually a nutritional calorie. This is something that I've done a video on as well. I will also link that down below. If you're interested in math and the number of calories that you're truly burning, that's a good resource. But this typically relates to the dietary calorie, and that is equal to 1,000 little c calories, the ones you learned about in chemistry or physics class, which is the energy required to raise 1 gram of water 1 degree centigrade. Now, there's always people out there that are team kilojoules. There are different areas of the world that measure their dietary energy in kilojoules. Honestly, one is not better than the other. It's just a matter of your frame of reference. If you use calories, use calories. If you use kilojoules, use kilojoules. It's two sides of the same coin. It's just calculated differently. One of them does the conversion for you in the back end with kilojoules, and one of them does it with just straight calories. It is what it is. You get used to one or the other and just continue to use it. Next up, we have CDA. You will sometimes see this as CD in kind of out there in the ether for things that are not necessarily related to cycling, but it's your coefficient of drag. And the reason the A is added for cycling because we're talking about the area of the rider on top of the bike as well. But CDA represents the ratio of drag to your velocity and the drag of the rider on top of the bike. So a lower ratio or a lower CDA means that you have less impact on your overall speed from the wind, right? The wind resistance coming at you. We want a smaller number. We want to be more aerodynamic because that translates into more speed. So that's why we buy aerodynamic helmets, aerodynamic bikes. We try to get lower on our position. We try to get closer and tighter together, narrow out those shoulders. We spend lots of money and go to wind tunnels if we have that kind of interest involved. But that's what that CDA is measuring. Sometimes you'll see that discussed in Zwift. There's actually a CDA consideration in their physics model. So different heights of riders are more aerodynamic. We have different bikes that are more aerodynamic, and so on and so forth. So just if you see that batted about, that's what it's referring to. Next up, we have CL. That refers to your crank length. So if you've ever seen somebody say, you know, what's your CL? That's your crank length. It's measured in millimeters. It's measured from the center of your crank to the pedal spindle. You will usually see those values between 165 and 175 millimeters. There's a very strong correlation between height or leg length and that crank length, but there's also adjustability when it comes to different execution like fit, hip angle. You'll find that triathletes use a shorter crank length than might be expected for their height because it opens up their hip angle a little bit more. So a lot to do with crank length, but just so you know that that's what that abbreviation refers to. Next up, we have CTL, and this, just like ATL, I'm going to refer you to that video down in the description and at the end screen to really understand this in more detail, but it's chronic training load, and this is what we represent as our fitness or overall conditioning. It's the amount of load that on average you have undertaken over the last 42 days. It's a weighted average, and this is just a representation of your homeostasis, what you're typically acclimated for. Working above that level, we'll start to dig a little bit in terms of fatigue, and working below that level, you'll start to recover. Next up, we have CP, and this stands for critical power. This particular concept probably could take its own video unto itself, but you will see this commonly used interchangeably with FTP and lactate threshold out there. Honestly, it's not the same thing. You know, you'll see a lot of casual users try to throw this term about interchangeably, but it's not the same value. It is close. It works out to be arithmetically close, but it is not referring to quite the same thing. A very high level definition is that this is the amount of power that you can kind of hold indefinitely without fatiguing. Obviously, practically speaking, we don't hold anything indefinitely, but it kind of sounds a little bit like FTP because we're talking about that lactate production and clearance being at a rate that is not accumulating more lactate, but it does end up being a little bit different. You will often see this as a graph. It creates the asymptote. So the line, you have a parabola, which is your power chart, and then you have the asymptote, which the parabola gets infinitely closer to but doesn't quite touch. That's actually critical power. And then anything above that line is your anaerobic work capacity or your watt prime, and below that is your steady state capability. So that value tends to be a little bit different than FTP. It's tested differently. There's some good resources out there if you're interested in it. You will find some coaching groups and certain pockets of the internet that really likes to focus more on critical power rather than FTP. There are definitely some benefits to using critical power over FTP, but there's also some cons, just like anything in life. But more often than not, you are going to see use of FTP. It tends to be a little bit more straightforward, and perhaps that comes from the fact that people are just more acclimated or comfortable with it. But understand that they're not quite the same. It would take me too long to describe all of that here, but if you want to understand that more, you can definitely take a look for some additional resources. The next thing we have here is CPV, which is circumferential pedal velocity. So this is the speed at which your legs are moving around the pedal stroke. And this is not cadence. It's not the same thing. It's actually the velocity, and we measure velocity in distance over time. RPM is not distance over time, right? It's more of a measurement of time than anything. And the reason that the pedal velocity becomes important is because we're trying to establish, again, the strain on the muscles, the force coming from the muscles. If you remember, power equals force times velocity. We kind of shorthand that to say RPM, but if you actually want to calculate that force, you need a true velocity value. So velocity, again, is distance over time. Well, you have the time element when it comes to the RPM, right? Revolutions per minute, but how do you get the distance? Well, you go back to those good old geometry days in middle school and you use your calculation for circumference. And then you would take 2 times pi times the radius, which is your crank length, right? Your crank length is the center of the crank to the pedal spindle, so that's creating what you would have in terms of circumference, and that's how you can get the circumference that you're traveling when you take a pedal stroke. But you're going to want to translate that number in millimeters for crank length into meters by dividing by 1,000, because we don't measure velocity in millimeters per second. We measure it in meters per second. So you have to do that conversion, right? So now you have your circumference, what you're traveling in terms of meters around the pedal stroke. Well, we still need to have distance over time. So we have the distance piece, and the time piece, well, we've done RPM, right? We know what our cadence is, but that's in minutes. So you're going to multiply your circumference by your RPM in, absolute value, whether that's 90, 65, whatever that might be, and then you're going to divide that value by 60, and that corrects for minutes to seconds. And then you will have how many meters per second you're traveling from a circumferential standpoint. And then if you wanted to work backwards and figure out how much torque or force you are putting into the legs, well, now you're using good old-fashioned algebra, right? We have power equals force times velocity, but if we want to solve for force, then we just divide both sides of the equation by velocity. So force becomes power divided by your circumferential velocity. And the reason that that becomes important is to understand which energy systems are being utilized, type 2 fibers versus type 1 muscle fibers, right? We're looking for optimal cadences. A lot of the science has shown that between 70 and 100 RPM at a steady state, it's really negligible in terms of impact on energy systems, but as you go towards the tails of the bell curve, in terms of high execution of power, or very high or very low cadences, now all of a sudden that force portion starts to get a little less stable and starts to tax the system in different ways. So this is not something that you necessarily need to understand or do for any reason, but if you do want to understand that, or you're reading something that they're talking about this, well, we're trying to work backwards from the metrics that we have available to us to calculate force. Typically we have power and leg speed available to us. So you can actually use those two variables to figure out your force. If you have a pedal-based power meter, it's probably collecting that data somewhere, but it doesn't show it to you. So you can make some suppositions at a certain execution of power, at a certain leg speed, that you are actually applying this much force to the muscles. Next up, we have FRC, which is functional reserve capacity. Now this is very similar to AWC, which is anaerobic work capacity, but instead of looking at an anaerobic rate above your VO2 max, we're looking at that rate above functional threshold power, or FTP. And there is a little bit of a difference, because when you're still working in that VO2 max zone, you're not fully anaerobic. You do have an aerobic component to that, which is a little bit more sparing to that value, but there's still a consequence to working above your FTP. So this value, again, gives you the number of kilojoules that you can operate at above your FTP. It's just kind of slicing data a little bit differently to have an understanding of what's in the tank and not necessarily just the matches you have to burn. Next up, we have FTP, functional threshold power. This is something that I think most of you are probably familiar with, but again, just a very broad stroke approach to this. It's a proxy for your lactate threshold, specifically your LT2. There are two lactate thresholds. Initially, you start to produce lactate right about that zone 2 to zone 3 break point, or zone 1 to zone 2 if you are using the 3-zone model from Steven Seiler. And then when you start to supersede your body's capability to clear lactate at the same rate it's being produced, that's your LT2. It's very often shorthanded as lactate threshold, and your FTP is testing for the approximation of that value. And I will talk about some additional terms here, but remember, just because your FTP is a value does not mean you can hold it for an hour. It just means your body is capable of producing and clearing that lactate at the same rate. Next up, we have HIIT or HIIT. This is high intensity training or high intensity interval training. I think more often than not, I see this used interchangeably, but sometimes you will see people use this as high intensity training is anything that's high intensity, right? If you can go out and do a racy group ride with your friends, that's HIIT or high intensity training. And high intensity interval training is specific to doing intervals or doing structured work. Again, you have to look at the context to know what people are referring to here. More often than not, I see it used interchangeably, but I think if you're really being pedantic about it, one of them just refers to high intensity and one of them refers to structured high intensity. Next up is HR, heart rate. Again, I think most people are familiar with that, but that's your heartbeats per minute. After that, we have HRR, which is heart rate reserve. Now, this is an interesting concept because this is the spread of heartbeats that you have available to you to use when you are doing activity. And it's the difference between your absolute maximum heart rate and your resting heart rate. So that value or that difference there is how much heart rate capacity you have available to you. But this isn't used on its own. You use it with the next metric, which is HRR with a percent sign, which is your heart rate reserve percentage, or percent of heart rate reserve. And this evaluates what percentage of your entire heart rate capacity is being utilized at different activities or different zones or different levels. And as you become more fit, you are using less of your heart rate reserve to perform the same amount of work. So I'll give you an example. Recently, I've been doing some sweet spot efforts. I found that I'm able to do about 86% of my FTP while still remaining in my zone 2 heart rate, which means I'm using a lot lower percentage of my heart rate reserve than I had when I was less fit, where my heart rate might have been more in my zone 3. So that's important when it comes to strain or fatigue, especially for endurance sport. We always talk a lot about power, whether it comes to cycling power or running power and execution, but we don't talk as much about, well, how does the heart rate kind of play into that? Just because you have that power available and you're trained does not mean that you are going to be able to last forever. Triathletes pay a lot of attention to this in managing their heart rate, especially as they get on the run. They don't want to break down prematurely so that the heart is struggling more to produce oxygen to the working muscles. So something that you'll see out there, heart rate reserve. If you're a user of certain platforms, you will see this used quite a bit as well. The next we have is HR max. This is just your max heart rate. You will see this very often in scientific literature as HR subscript max, and this is just more of a scientific term. I don't think you see most people using this in colloquial terms, but if you're reading a scientific paper, that's how you will see max heart rate delineated. Next up is IF, that's intensity factor, and this is just a ratio or representation of how hard you are working against your FTP. So if you have a 0.85 intensity factor, that really means that you are working at about 85% of your FTP. And it's calculated by normalized power divided by your FTP. And the reason normalized power is used is because average power kind of ends up skewing a bit low when you talk about maybe some coasting or some soft pedaling or going around turns or whatever that might be. And it's not really reflective of the work you're doing, so it helps to correct for that. I'll talk about normalized power here in a moment, but just understand that it's the ratio of your normalized power to your FTP. The next up we have is joules, and joules is a unit of work. Mathematically, it's the measurement of work to move from the point of action, 1 Newton over 1 meter. That's really abstract for what we're doing here, but it's just basically meant to calculate how much work is being done as we move our legs on the bike, or if we are running, whatever it is we're doing. That's the unit of measure we use. We use joules rather than straight newtons, because there's other elements like friction or resistance that impact how much work is actually done, not just your force. What you'll see more often is kilojoules, and that's just 1,000 joules because of our size and the amount of power that we're putting out. Kilojoules is a more practical measure, because if not, we're going to have way too many digits here. So you'll see how much work you perform during a ride in terms of kilojoules. It's just 1,000 joules. Next up is LSD, and no, not what Teddy's probably doing in the kitchen over there. It is long slow or long steady distance, and this refers to training that endurance zone, those zone 2 miles or zone 1 miles in the 3-zone model, that really strong base you want to build. You ride for longer periods of time at that endurance base so that you can build your aerobic system, you can build your endurance. Very important stuff. I talk about this all the time, but sometimes you will see training as LSD training, which is long, slow, or long, steady distance training. Next up, we have LTHR, which is lactate threshold heart rate, and this is the estimated heart rate that you would achieve when you are working at your lactate threshold, or at your FTP, if you want to shorthand it that way. But the cool thing about lactate threshold heart rate is once you start to become more trained, you're after maybe your first couple of years of cycling and you've built up your heart rate and your fitness, that becomes very stable, because your maximum heart rate is pretty much genetically defined. And yes, it'll decline with time and with age, but the more you train, the more you kind of mitigate that decline. You'll find that your max heart rate stays a little bit more stable over time. But understanding that that lactate threshold heart rate remains relative and the same, your power, your FTP can change around that value, but your lactate threshold heart rate remains the same. And why this is effective is because if you're working at driving your FTP up and you're doing intervals, maybe you're doing threshold intervals, if you find that what was originally output at your lactate threshold heart rate starts to be at a lower heart rate, might be a good indication that you're starting to move the needle upwards in terms of your FTP, or maybe less optimally moving in the wrong direction, right? But you don't want to take this in a vacuum with a specific ride, but if you start to notice trend data over time, if you're doing 4x8s or 5x5s a couple of times per week, and you find after a few weeks that for the same amount of power, your heart rate's quite a bit lower, it means you can start using that bias button, pushing those up, and that's when you start to get a stimulus and a response, and you can start pushing that threshold power upwards, which is something that we're always looking to do. The next term is MAOD, maximal accumulated oxygen deficit. Yes, that's a mouthful, and you will almost always see this primarily in scientific literature. This is something that requires some lab testing, but what this is doing is representing somebody's anaerobic capacity from an oxygen uptake standpoint. You can use this type of testing to evaluate somebody's capability to work at an anaerobic rate, not just by measuring power. And the reason for something like this is that you can have two athletes with a good amount of training, with the same FTP, with the same VO2 max value. Maybe they're both at a VO2 max of 85, but their capacity to work above that VO2 max could be drastically different. So what this test actually strives to do is to measure that type of execution and measure the delta, or the difference, between the predicted oxygen need to perform a certain level of output and then the oxygen uptake being performed by the athlete. And that delta and their capacity to work at that delta can give you a good understanding of what their capabilities are to work anaerobically. Clearly, some of this is trainable and some of it is going to end up being genetic or based on somebody's phenotype, but it's a laboratory measure of this type of capacity, not just a power measurement. Next is MAP, maximal aerobic power. This is again usually lab tested. It's the maximal amount of oxygen able to be delivered to the muscles, usually measured in a ramp test, and it just kind of gives you that break point between aerobic and anaerobic. Next is MHR. As I mentioned before, HR max is what you'll see in the scientific literature, but MHR is maximum heart rate. This is what you're almost always going to see used casually out there, discussed in forums and in articles. The next term is MLSS, maximal or maximum lactate steady state. Again, this is another term that you're going to see thrown about interchangeably with FTP or critical power or lactate threshold. It is not quite the same. I know that it seems like we're splitting hairs here, but this is a more scientific term, and it's a measure of where you can hit that maximum amount of lactate being produced and cleared in real time. I know it sounds a lot like lactate threshold, but this is more of a measure of kind of what you can hold in perpetuity or indefinitely as well, and not accumulate lactate in the system. So again, this is something that needs to be lab tested. It really ends up responding to the same types of training, but it is a little bit different. It tends to be a slightly lower value than your FTP. But just understand, if you see that thrown around, again, very often people are trying to refer to the same thing, but it's just a different way of lab measuring that ability to work over a period of time while not accumulating lactate. Next on the list, we have MMP, which is mean maximal power, and this is a term used to describe the maximum amount of power over a certain duration. So your 30-second power, your 1-minute power, 5-minute power, 30-minute power, right? So your mean maximal power is just meant to represent your maximum power over that duration. Capital N is for newtons, so that's your unit of force, and 1 newton is the amount of force required to move 1 kilogram 1 meter per second squared. Next up, we have NMP, which is your neuromuscular power. This refers to the capacity to work at a neuromuscular level, so above your anaerobic level. This is very short bursts of power. Maximum 30 seconds, usually closer to 10, 15, maybe 20 seconds. This is your sprint level power. This does not require any kind of oxygen. This means your brain is telling your muscles to fire as hard as they possibly can until basically they shut down. So NMP just refers to that neuromuscular power, which is defined by your zone 7 in your 7-zone model. Next up is NP, that stands for normalized power. As I alluded to earlier, normalized power is a way to kind of correct for some of the shortcomings of average power. When we measure our power and our output, we want to kind of understand what that impact is on our body. And factoring things like coasting or soft pedaling doesn't really do that very well. And that's where average power starts to fall apart a little bit. So there's a way of calculating normalized power. I'm not going to go through how that's done. I will list that down below. But your cycling computer or your training program, that does that in real time. It just kind of calculates, it weights those averages over 30-second increments, and then it helps to just kind of drop out those lows that are going to drive your power downwards. So normalized power is a more effective measure of understanding the physiological load or demand on the body versus average power that just kind of gives you the arithmetic mean. Next up, you have OBLA, which is onset of blood lactate accumulation. And this is really the same as MLSS, or maximal lactate steady state. You're just measuring it differently. One, you are measuring the maximum value, and one, you are measuring the break point, but you're coming at the same idea or the same concept. Again, a very scientific concept, not something that you're going to see in more colloquial terms or discussed very commonly, but people who do go through this type of testing or distill some of the scientific literature, you may see this referred to out there. Next up, we have PDC, which is your power distribution chart. And this is a histogram of your power execution. And almost every single one of you, I guarantee you, has seen this. If you've ridden on Zwift, or if you've used Strava or a lot of other programs, it literally just shows you that bar chart of all of your different zones and how much execution in each zone comprised the total sum of your ride. So if you're doing an endurance ride, you'll see very tall bars in maybe zone 1 and zone 2, and very low or non-existent bars in zone 3+. Or if you're doing a very high intensity ride, you may see that clustered way over on the side with zone 3, 4, 5, and beyond. It's just showing you how your power was distributed over the course of an activity. Next you will see is Pmax, and Pmax is your maximal power. So this is the absolute maximum amount of peak power you can apply with both legs over one pedal stroke. So it's not something you can necessarily hold for 5 seconds or 10 seconds. It's the absolute maximum power you are capable of putting into the pedals without obviously some of the power spikes or inefficiencies of some of the electronic devices that we have. But when you get a good read on that, it's actually a pretty decent appraisal of what your neuromuscular capacity might be. So sometimes you will see things referenced in terms of your Pmax. It's your absolute maximum power over one pedal stroke. Next up, we have PMC. This is the performance management chart. And again, I'm going to refer you to that Fitness Explained video, but this is a graphical representation of the relationship between your acute training load, your chronic training load, and your training stress balance, which I'll touch on here briefly. But if you want to see how those those relate to one another and how it tracks your progress over the course of the season, year, or multiple years. You'll use something like a Training Peaks or Today's Plan or even Strava to understand that. But again, I highly recommend watching that video if you haven't already. It will really break this down into more understandable detail. The next term you'll see very often in scientific literature is PVO2 max, and that's just your power at your VO2 max. Technically, VO2 max is a measurement of oxygen uptake and not power, but very often when we're just kind of talking to each other, we refer to power execution in our VO2 max zone. We all understand what we mean by that, but if we're talking about that in terms of a research article or a study, they have to call that out specifically as the power at VO2 max. So that's where you'll see PVO2 max called out. Next up, we have RHR, which is resting heart rate. That's your heart rate at rest, not just sitting here, me talking, being kind of restful, but true rest. It's usually taken by a device like a Garmin or a Whoop or whatever you have automatically, usually maybe right around waking time so that you are lying prone and resting. So it's really kind of like your low end of your heart rate. And again, we use that value when we talked about your HRR, your heart rate reserve. That's the lower limit that you subtract from your upper limit. Next is RPE. Probably hear this batted about. This is rate of perceived exertion, and this is relative to you. And this can be impacted by a number of things like sleep, nutrition, overall recovery or fatigue. All of these things can play into RPE, but in a general sense, you can also use that relative value to understand how you're feeling at the same execution of power over time. You can perceive some trends there, right? If you always do the same workout once a week or twice a week to build maybe your threshold, how after 4, 6, 8 weeks does that feel to you? How do you perceive that exertion? Does it feel like it's easier? It doesn't mean that it's easy. It just means that it feels like it's less hard than it was before. So it's actually a very important metric. It doesn't seem all that scientific, but it's very important. It's included in a lot of scientific studies. So don't ignore RPE. It's not just HTFU, just work as hard as you can until you blow up. Pay attention to RPE over time. Next thing you'll see is SST, that's sweet spot training. Sweet spot is that area between about 84% of your FTP and around 97%. Sometimes you'll see those breakpoints a little bit differently depending on what type of zone structure you use or what type of program or coach that you use. But the idea is it's that area just below your threshold. And a lot of good work can be done at that sweet spot area. It can work to enhance your MLSS, which is your maximal lactate steady state. It can help to push your FTPE up from the bottom, right, by accumulating more time at that area just below and increasing your tolerance to that. You know, sweet spot training takes a lot of lumps sometimes, but it's a very effective way of training to introduce a couple times during the year in like a short block, right? 6 to 8 weeks of sweet spot training can really do a lot to assist you in your fatigue resistance and pushing up that FTP, and you follow it up with additional periodized training. So it's a very effective way to train. Next up, we have TSB. This stands for Training Stress Balance. And at risk of sounding like a broken record, I would highly, highly recommend clicking that link down below or the one at the end screen here to watch that Fitness Explained video. If you really want to understand this metric, it could be a very helpful metric to use. And this represents your freshness or your form, or maybe lack thereof. And it's the relationship between your chronic training load or your homeostasis and your acute training load, which is your recency or the fatigue that you're building up. And it's either a positive number, which means you're starting to become fresh and recovered, or a negative number, which means you're starting to become a little bit more fatigued. So managing that balance can be very important, and it's a good metric to understand. So again, take a look at that video if you haven't already. And on the same note, TSS, again, I discussed that a lot in the Fitness Explained video. TSS is a measurement of load accumulated over the course of a particular activity. So this is calculated by intensity factor over time. It's a more complex formula than that, but you're accumulating load, and this is the number that builds your ATL and your CTL. You take that number and you give it your weighted average over your 7 days or your 42 days, and that's what gives you that final number, that CTL or your ATL. Next up is TTE, or time to exhaustion. If you've watched my recent videos about the Zwift Academy, you've probably heard me reference this before, and this is the amount of time you can actually hold your FTP. I know I say this a lot, but people really don't understand that just because you have an evaluated FTP does not mean you can or should have to hold that for 1 hour. There are other limiters like muscular endurance, mental fortitude, aerobic ability. All of these play into your ability to hold your FTP for 1 hour. So your time to exhaustion is a measurement of how long you can actually or practically hold that number. It's something that can be measured in a lab. It's not particularly practical to do so, but it's most accurately measured in a lab. You can probably get a rough measurement of that by actually trying to go out and execute your FTP for an hour, but good luck to you, because that kind of sucks. I mean, unless you're a time trialist, most people really hate that type of exercise. Or programs like WKO tries to work out that value for you by using your historical data. There are some limitations to that in that you go through ebbs and flows through the season, right? So if your recency has shown that you are doing a lot of your bases at work, you're not really taxing that threshold power level. So it might understate your time to fatigue because you're just not executing or demonstrating your true ability there. So just something to take with a grain of salt. You should never take one individual metric and look at it in a very reductionist standpoint and look at those things in a vacuum and focus on only one thing. All of these work in concert with one another. So it's just a data point to look at, but don't necessarily hang everything on there. Now, if you have that tested and you are a time trialist and maybe your time to exhaustion is 30 minutes, you want to start to push that upwards. So there's certain workouts or there's certain training plans that you can take on to improve that capacity, but don't just use that number and throw a bunch of spaghetti at the wall trying to fix this and that and the other thing. Periodization of training requires focus on different energy systems and different limitations at different times during the course of your season or your year. So just bear that in mind. VI is variability index, and it's a measure of how variable your ride is around your average. So I talked about the difference between average power and normalized power, and variability index is a ratio of normalized power to average power. And it shows how kind of spiky that ride is in terms of your execution of power. If you perform a time trial at 250 watts for 45 minutes, well, your average power and your normalized power, if you're not spiking all over the place, will be one and the same, and that ratio will be 1. But if you go do a crit race, if you've ever done a race like that or a race on Zwift, you'll realize that you spike your power, maybe you're at 800 watts and you're at 150 watts, and then for a little while you're at 220 watts, and then you're back up to 900 watts. Well, that's really variable. And when you take your normalized power calculation, it sees that, and it will give you a much higher value than your straight arithmetic mean or your average power. So showing the ratio between those two things is your variability index. And there's no right or wrong, good or bad. It really comes down to the intention of the workout or the activity. If you're looking to do a time trial, then a high variability index is not so hot. You want to try to keep that power as stable as possible. You don't want to be burning those matches or prematurely fatiguing. You want to be able to hold that steady state for a longer period of time. Same goes for recovery. But when you're going for a race, well, you don't want to limit yourself to steady state. You need to be able to roll with the punches. You need to go with the moves. So it's not good or bad inherently speaking. It's more of, is it the right or wrong thing for the particular event or workout? The higher the number, the more variable. The lower the number, the less variable. Your baseline being 1, and then anything above that gives you that higher value. The next is VO2 Max, and technically speaking, this is your maximal oxygen uptake, something that needs to be measured in a lab, although Garmin devices actually do a pretty decent job. They tend to be within 3% of measured VO2 Max in a lab, which is very interesting that they're able to do that. They're able to use your power, your weight, and some other elements that they work in the back end to kind of work out an estimate of your VO2 Max. It's basically showing a maximal amount of oxygen that you are able to take up aerobically to feed those working muscles. Now, VO2 Max tends to be overused. Sometimes people get the impression that VO2 Max is the end-all be-all, and while you can basically glean some generalities from different VO2 Maxes, you know, elite and pro level athletes tend to have higher VO2 Maxes, but there's still a lot of variation there. But understanding it's not the end-all be-all. It's telling you how much oxygen delivery you have, but it's not necessarily going to be a limiter for most athletes in certain regards. So if you want to go pursue a certain type of racing, it doesn't mean you have to have an ultra high VO2 max to do that. And it doesn't mean that somebody with an ultra high VO2 max is going to be good at racing. There are so many other elements, right? There's training, there's muscular density, there's tactics, there's all these things that feed into it. So it's really not a metric that you want to look at on its own. Now, that being said, understanding how VO2 max works can help you get an understanding of where you are at personally. VO2 max is somewhat trainable, but it's very much limited by genetics. So when you are brand new or you are untrained, you have a lot of capacity to build up that VO2 max, but you're really just pushing it up against your originally preset genetic potential. So you might start and be off the couch at 20. But as you train and you become more adept at being able to perform different executions of power or ability, you'll end up pushing that forward, and you might end up at a 45 or a 50, whatever that is. You're not really increasing your genetic VO2 max, you're just increasing your capacity to achieve your genetic potential. Now, you can also train and nudge that number up a little bit, usually maybe a couple of percent. Maybe if you're at 55, you might nudge that up to 60, but it's not something that you're going to be at 55 as a trained athlete and you can push yourself up to 90. That's just not how things work. Your weight has a little bit of a bearing, so if you drop a couple of pounds, you can increase your VO2 max a little bit that way as well. But again, you're not going to get elite level VO2 max just by merit of working really, really hard. You kind of end up hitting a steady state around your genetic potential, and that's where you are. It doesn't mean that the person with the higher VO2 max is going to be better or faster than you are. They just have a higher capacity for certain oxygen uptake, which might benefit them in certain ways. But again, you've got to train those systems. So it's all well and good to have a VO2 max of 95. If you don't train right, you're not going to be any faster than the person with the VO2 max of 25. W, the capital W, stands for watts. I think we all know what watts are at this point, but if you see just the capital W, that is reserved for watts. A W with the apostrophe is watt prime, and that is the same as that AWC, or that anaerobic work capacity. Very often in kind of the coaching world, you'll hear this more referenced as watt prime, but you may also see it as AWC, or anaerobic work capacity. And the last one on the list is W/kg, or WKG, and that's watts per kilogram. I think any of you who have been on Zwift for any amount of time are very familiar with the WKG, what that means, right? Your power divided by your weight in kilograms, your watts per kilogram. But many of you may not understand why that watts per kilogram is maybe relevant or important. And it's a way of doing a relative comparison between different riders or different outputs, or trying to estimate speed. Because we all have different body types, sizes, different raw power executions, and 300 watts is not just 300 watts across the board. So if two people going up a hill at 300 watts start at the same time, and one of them is 55 kilograms and one of them is 85 kilograms, the person who's 55 kilograms is going to go faster. Even though they're putting out the same amount of power, that relative power to their weight is going to have an impact on them, especially when you're going uphill. When you're going on the flat roads, yes, raw watts tend to dominate, but to you personally, it may be important to understand that difference so that you can see what the impact on speed might be, even on a flat road. If your FTP is 300 watts and you want to do a time trial at 300 watts, well, you could go faster, not a ton faster, but a little bit faster if you drop a little bit of weight. You don't want to drop weight so drastically or so quickly that you end up losing that power, but if you're able to maintain that 300 watts and drop a couple of kilograms, you will, by merit of moving less mass, go faster. So understanding that relative value of power from one athlete to the next, it's a little bit easier to see this in terms of your watts per kilogram, right? Who might be performing more work relative to their size. Now there is the Coggin chart out there, which is a chart of different race categories and different executions of power and where people fall in terms of watts per kilogram. This has very much fallen out of favor, not because it's a bad chart, but because people interpret it incorrectly. They think that, oh, just because somebody's, a cat X, they need to have this many watts per kilogram in terms of their FTP. Well, obviously you can't say that, because there's a ton of elements that go into that value in your success as a racer. What type of race are you doing? What is your phenotype? What is your repeatability? How is your aerobic engine, right? It's not just watts per kilogram. All other things being optimized, that's where that chart really comes into play. But it's really tough to make that appraisal based on that chart on its own without looking at some of those other elements. It might be a way for you to kind of compare yourself in a very general way to people in the same category. We use this in terms of Zwift in terms of categorization. Cats A through D are based on watts per kilogram because it's trying to measure out relative ability between riders. Certainly not a perfect system, especially with the Zwift physics model, but the point of doing that is trying to pair up people based on relative ability in watts per kilogram versus raw watts, which don't tend to carry across as accurately. But I know that this was a dense video, a lot of information here. You're not going to remember all of this. You really learn by exposing yourself, but this hopefully serves as a reference. And instead of having to come back to this video, I'm going to leave a Dropbox link down below for a Word document that goes through A to Z, all of these acronyms, what they stand for, and then a quick 1 or 2 sentence blurb as to what these particular elements mean. And you can go ahead and download it if you want. You can edit it. You can add whatever you want. You can use it as something that you can pull up real quick on your phone. If you're reading something you don't remember what it means, it might refresh your memory. Hopefully it'll be something that you can use and learn from and fold into your own training modalities. And you know, I get excited about this stuff. Maybe some of you guys too. I'm just kind of a weird training nerd type of person. I don't know, throw things at me. It is what it is. But if you have any other questions, or if you think I've left anything out, let me know in the comments below. I'll be happy to add those acronyms or those terms that might be a little bit unclear to people. I know that this list isn't exhaustive. If you got any value out of this video, please hit the thumbs up button. It really does help the video and the channel quite a bit. Subscribe if you haven't already. I'm going to leave the Fitness Explained video right here and the calories video right here for further learning. And as always, I will catch you in the next one. See ya.